Hello, class, and welcome to this is week 6. Time is flying by. Week 6 of government. For the past couple of weeks, we have been talking about Congress, what they do, what they can't do, what they should do. Well, we're going to turn our attention this week to the executive branch. And of course, the executive branch is headed up by the President of the United States. The President is, of course, in addition to being chief executive, also the commander-in-chief of all the military forces, the highest representative our country can send to negotiate or talk with foreign leaders, and is the leader of their political party, whichever one that may be. So, yeah, in addition to being the head of one of the three branches of government, the president has an awful lot of other duties. Small wonder that most people call it the most important, most powerful job in the world. Basically, a president, in addition to, again, enforcing the laws, which is the executive branch's purpose, they head up most of what we call the federal bureaucracy. Now, we will talk more about bureaucracy as we go along. As a matter of fact, next week's lesson really takes a deep look at what we call the federal bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is basically the pencil and paper portion of the government, the office enforcement of laws. The president, of course, when we look at the requirements, you remember the requirements for Congress. Requirements for president are a little bit more, little bit stricter, but not that bad. President's got to be 35 years old, have lived in the United States for 14 years, and the big one is the third one, has to be a natural-born citizen. Now, of course, that was in the news when Barack Obama was president because people like Donald Trump brought up questions about whether or not Obama was actually born in Hawaii. I'll spoil it for you. He was born in Hawaii by every metric, so that was really a non-issue. But if Obama had been born in Africa and was not a natural-born U.S. citizen, he would have been technically ineligible to be president. But everything's cool. He was born in Hawaii. The idea behind that is to make sure that there's very little a chance of a foreign element taking control of the executive branch in our government. Of course, a lot of people say Russia's calling the shots now, but again, that's another story and mostly untrue. Now, as we've talked about earlier, presidents are not directly elected by the people. They are chosen or elected by the Electoral College. We all know what that's all about. States have a certain number of electors based on their population and based on, for the most part, the popular vote of a state, those electors go to candidate A or candidate B. Now, in terms of the states themselves, the states have a certain amount of latitude to decide how to send their electors out. There are two states, Maine and Nebraska, that don't have a winner-take-all system. They instead will take two of their electoral votes, which are the two Senate seats that they have, and give them to the popular vote winner. But other than that, they award electoral votes based on electoral district, a congressional district. So, all the time, Maine and Nebraska split their votes. Not a lot of votes. I think Nebraska has 4 and Maine has 5, or vice versa. But yeah, it's they base them according to which congressional districts they win. I kind of like that. That gives a little bit better cross section, I think, of what the United States public is thinking. But be that as it may, before you even get to that point, though, you have to be nominated by a political party. There are two parties, of course, Republicans and Democrats. You have to be nominated to be a presidential candidate. To win that, you've got to win your party's nomination. And to get the nomination, you have to win a bunch of primaries, state primary elections, or state caucuses, which are basically meetings of party officials at the state level. Sometimes there are state conventions, which are almost like drive-through affairs sometimes. The primaries, caucuses all take place between February and early June of a presidential election year. 35 states have primaries, 8 have caucuses, and sometimes you run into some really arcane rules into how the party distributes delegates. Constitution doesn't tell them how to distribute delegates. They're private political parties. They can award them however the heck they see fit. And it can be a very, very complicated process. And you really have to have people know what the heck's going on to figure out all these arcane old rules or whatever. But the formal nomination takes place at a party convention, usually in the early fall, late summer, early fall of an election year. The party convention is a national meeting of the party. They approve what's called a party platform. That is a series of position statements. The Republican Party believes in A, B, C, D, Z, and goes all the way down. Presidential candidate usually agrees 100% more or less with the party platform. There may be some mild disagreement here and there, but for the most part, the party's platform is going to reflect the views of the person that they nominate to be president. Of course, the national parties have a chance to dominate news coverage for a full week with the party conventions and all that jazz. It used to be the convention, the actual event that they met at, went a long ways towards choosing the presidential nominee. For the most part now, though, the party's nominee is known well before the convention. Someone has clearly gotten the most delegates of the state primaries, caucuses, and conventions, and so there's little or no drama. Usually during the convention or right before, the presumptive nominee will choose their vice presidential candidate. No one runs for vice president. You just happen to get that in the course of running. As you would expect, because the presidency of the United States is arguably the most powerful position on planet Earth, there's a whole lot of money spent to land a job that officially pays you only $400,000 a year. In the 2012 presidential election, each party spent more than $1 billion with a B dollars in their presidential campaign. When you add in all the expenditures for all the other national races, Senate and House, $6 billion was spent on national elections that year, 2012. That was 8 years ago. We are almost certainly going to eclipse that here in 2020, I promise you, by quite a bit. There is a prohibition against who can give to a presidential campaign, but there are people who who are employed specifically to find legal ways around these laws. So yes, big money donations are an issue. And if you think about it, they will always be an issue. Again, government has a lot of power. They have a lot of authority. Therefore, if you are in a private business or even you have a interest of any kind, there is a lot you can gain by getting the government on your side. There's an awful lot that can be gained by having the government in your back pocket. Therefore, there's going to be a lot of effort to curry favor with that government. If the government didn't have so much power, there would be less incentive to spend billions and billions of dollars just to try to get friendly with them. So as long as government has a large amount of authority, and unfortunately I think they will, there's always going to be a way that big money and big influence is going to play a factor. It is impossible to remove that. You can try, and we have tried, but it's not going to happen. There's just simply too much at stake. We mentioned the Electoral College being directly responsible for the election of the president. Few people at the time of the Constitution saw a direct popular election of the president as a good thing, and that's why they invented the Electoral College. The Constitution also allowed state legislatures to decide how to choose their electors. Again, each state has the option, and a lot of states are going the option. Some of them are going to try to end the Electoral College by just giving all of their electoral votes to the national popular vote winner, whoever that may be. The idea is if enough states do that, they can make the Electoral College insignificant. The problem is you've got to change the Constitution to do that. Need 3/4 of the state legislatures to do that ordinarily. And for a lot of small states, they like having this kind of authority. If you live in Wyoming with 3 electoral votes, this is the only time where you're almost on an even keel with some of these larger states. And so the president or whoever's running for president has to pay attention to you because you have electoral votes. There have been some other changes in how Americans elect a president. The original plan turned out to be kind of idealistic and cumbersome. The founders, quite frankly, did not count on the role that political parties would play. They saw the role of political parties in other overseas democracies, and they didn't like them. They didn't explicitly outlaw them, obviously, in the Constitution, but they made no constitutional provision for political parties as such. And again, there's lots of evidence that the Founding Fathers were very, very distrustful of that. Early on, we found out very quickly that the way of electing presidents through an electoral college that was entirely considered by state legislatures was going to be a problem, because originally the Constitution called for the person who got the most electoral votes to be president. The one with the second most electoral votes was vice president. By default, I guess. But yeah, that was the way it was done, and it led to a big standoff in the year 1800, only the third presidential election, where there was a tie for the vice presidency between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And a guy you may have heard of, Alexander Hamilton, was the one who finally crossed lines and said, okay, let's give it to Mr. Jefferson here. And that indirectly really led to his spar there, his duel with Aaron Burr, which was fatal for Mr. Hamilton. But again, by then it was obvious that the constitutional way of electing presidents could be improved. Again, as much as I love the Constitution, it's not perfect. That's why we gave ourselves the means to change it. And change it we did with the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. The 12th Amendment, under this plan, electors vote separately for the president and the vice president. When a person votes in a presidential election, you're still actually voting for the electors. For those who are going to the polls on November 3rd, you will not see on the ballot Donald Trump, Joe Biden. It will say electors for Donald Trump, electors for Joe Biden, because that's who you're voting for. You're voting for one of Virginia's 13 electors who are chosen by whichever party gets the most votes in Virginia. Those 13 electors will become part of the Electoral College that will elect our next president. 538 total electors, the 435 members of the House, 100 members of the Senate, and, do you remember? 3 for the District of Columbia. They do get 3 electoral votes in this. So the magic number for 538, the majority, 270. That's the magic number that you will be seeing all across TV screens if you look at any news channel over the next few weeks, because that's the magic number to clinch the presidency. We've told you about each state, of course, awarding their electoral votes in such a fashion. The first real test of the 12th Amendment and how it did things was the 1824 presidential election, where Andrew Jackson actually received the most popular votes, but he did not receive the most electoral votes. That sounds familiar because that's happened 5 times, and that happened in our most recent presidential election. Hillary Clinton actually had 3 million more votes overall than Donald Trump. You know what that means? Absolutely nothing. The Electoral College, which both candidates were trying to win, not the popular vote, the Electoral College, went for Trump because he was able to win some very, very crucial states. Also in the 2000 election, where George W. Bush beat Al Gore by 1 electoral vote and a very close vote in Florida, as it turned out, for the national, like every single vote total, Gore had more total votes, but in the Electoral College, George W. Bush had the advantage. Now, that was a 271 to 269 win for George W. Bush. Now, I remember after of course, it was very closely contested in Florida, and Florida, by a very narrow margin, went to Bush, and that put him over the top, 271. There was, in a group that I was in at the time, this is pre-Facebook, they were suggesting, they were Democrats, and they were suggesting, you know, if we can get a couple of these electors to not vote the way they're supposed to, we can hijack this presidency. That idea was quickly shot down by fellow Democrats. They held the Electoral College with such esteem that to subverted in that way was absolutely unconscionable in the year 2000. Fast forward 16 years, and after Donald Trump evidently beat Hillary Clinton in the Electoral College, Democrats actively asked for electors not to vote for Trump. So in the span of 16 years, the Electoral College went from this sacrosanct, holy thing that you don't mess with to just another political tool, according to people. That's a coarsening of debate. That does not make me optimistic for the future. Hopefully we can stem that. Again, 5 times the candidate who won the national popular vote did not win the election. There are some times when there is even more often the case where a president does not win a majority of votes. You get third-party candidates, very significant third-party runs in 1992 and 1996 meant that Bill Clinton won 2 terms as president without ever winning the national majority vote. He had what's called a plurality. 42% for Clinton, 41% for Dole, and 8% for Ross Perot. But of course, the Electoral College is how we determine the winner, and Bill Clinton won safe and sound in the Electoral College each time. Again, the Electoral College maintains that all states have some kind of authority. Without it, presidential candidates would probably not pay too much attention to areas without a high population density. Think about it. All you're going is for the most votes. You're going to be spending your time and attention where the most people are, where you get the most bang for your buck. If you're going to broadcast a speech to somebody on a stump, you're going to do it where the most people are so the most people can hear you. You're not going to do it out in the middle of nowhere. So the electoral party system helps us in that respect. The unintended consequence of the Electoral College system is it really maintains the two-party system. It is very, very difficult for a third party to get any electoral votes because you got to win a state. And third-party candidacies, not since 1972 has a true third-party candidate won electoral votes in a presidential race. All right, next lesson is after you become president. Being very optimistic here, obviously. There have been 44 presidents now in U.S. history, and they have come from all walks of life. Not going to ask you to remember any of this, but the oldest president was Ronald Reagan when he was 70, but that was eclipsed by Donald Trump, who was 72 when he was elected a couple of years ago. 8 presidents have been born in Virginia. That's the record. Most have had some kind of military or political experience before becoming president. Again, Donald Trump very much the exception there. The average age of presidents when they took office, 53. Tallest president, Abe Lincoln, 6 feet 4 inches tall. The shortest, James Madison, 5 feet 4 inches tall. Again, not going to require you to remember any of this, but because there are only 44 people in this club, presidential trivia is kind of a thing here. Again, as we mentioned earlier, the actual salary for a president is $400,000. George Washington's salary originally, he was the first president, was $25,000 a year. Now, of course, in addition to the $400K, there are lots of other perks to being president. No one runs for the president for the salary. Of course, you get to live in this big, beautiful house, the White House, rent-free. You get the Camp David retreat to use at your discretion. You get money for a staff, travel expenses. But again, no one's running for president because you get paid a 6-figure salary. No, you're getting paid because you get more power than any other living, breathing creature on the planet. The vice president has been called the most insignificant office ever. And again, in terms of constitutionally stated duties, the vice president has only one, and that is as president of the Senate. And even then, the only thing a vice president can do in the Senate is break a tie. So if the vice president were truly doing exactly what the Constitution said that they could do, they wouldn't be doing anything except waiting around for a tie vote in the Senate. Again, no one campaigns for vice president. Vice presidents are chosen by the presidential nominees for their ability to attract voters that the president probably could not reach. If the president is a an urban cowboy from Texas. He's not going to choose another urban cowboy from Texas on a party. He's going to be choosing some small farmer from Maine or Washington State or something like that. Again, to kind of what they call balance the ticket. Presidential succession has been something that has changed in the Constitution over the years, and of course has become a big item recently with President Trump testing positive for COVID and speculation on, well, what if? What happens if? About every 20 years, for one juncture there, we were losing a president who died in office. So presidential succession was a thing. We were paying very, very close attention to it. But we do have laws in the Constitution and amendments to the Constitution which provide for an orderly transition. What you're seeing right now is the order of presidential succession, and it is pretty cut and dried. If the president can't go, it's the vice president. If the president and the vice president can't go, it's the Speaker of the House. If they're also incapacitated, President pro tempore of the Senate, and so forth and so on. You'll see all these cabinet secretaries who are there. One of the traditions in the State of the Union address is that one cabinet member is not in the building. They are called the designated survivor. And they even made a TV series out of this a few years ago where I think it was a bomb went off during the State of the Union. President, Vice President, everybody's dead except the Secretary of the Interior. He was back at the White House going, oh my God. And so that was the plot point for a show. Very unlikely that will happen, but just in case the worst comes to worst, and the pandemic, of course, we're thinking about the worst, there is one of this order of succession that is kept away from the State of the Union. 1841, William Henry Harrison died after only a month in office. There were some questions about John Tyler becoming the president because, again, the Constitution addressed it, but it was not really written in stone. There was some leeway in the line of succession for president. We eventually passed a few amendments which made it clearer. One amendment you've probably heard about here recently is the 25th Amendment. If the president is deemed incapacitated, how do we go about doing that? Let's say the president has got a mental illness and he thinks he's able to go, but he obviously can't. There are ways. The 25th Amendment creates ways where the vice president can, after certain criteria is met, take over for the vice president. A little trivia point. George W. Bush twice had to stop or halt his duties as president while he was serving because he was going under anesthesia for, otherwise simple procedures. But if you're under anesthesia, you can't carry out the duties as president. So, yeah, technically, he had to surrender his presidency to the vice president very briefly a couple of times during his presidency. Let's talk about the other duties of the president. We mentioned, of course, he's the chief executive, he or she, but it's been he's all to this point. The president is also commander-in-chief of the military. They are the highest ranking officer in all the military, even though they are a civilian. They have not taken a military oath necessarily. So the idea behind civilian control of the military is very crucial in the Constitution. Again, what did the Founding Fathers just experience? They experienced oppression at the hands of another nation's military. They wanted to make sure that whatever military they came up with, of course they were fond more of militias than military, they wanted to make sure that no matter what happened, it was citizens controlling them. And it was not a private military. It was not the government controlling them. It was civilian control. The founders, of course, did not want a powerful standing army. Later, as we went along, we realized, again, it makes perfect sense. A nation this large, this diverse, this rich is going to have to protect its borders. And so a standing army was required. The president does not have the power to declare war. Let's go to checks and balances again. Congress declares war. The war-making authority of the federal government in that sense is limited to Congress. Only Congress can declare war. Now, presidents have ordered troops to take the field several times without going so far as the war declaration. In all our history, actually, think about all the times we've used the military for this, that, or the other thing. We've only declared war 5 times. War of 1812, 1846 against Mexico, 1898 against Spain, World War I, and World War II. What's missing? The Civil War. The North, the Union, never declared war on the South. Instead, Lincoln, at the first of the war, called for 100,000 troops to put down an insurrection. Of course, the war lasted 5 bloody years, but it was not a war, per se, insofar as Congress did not pass a war declaration. But just about every president has used the military to some degree to accomplish some task, apart from just a regular war. Matter of fact, there hasn't been a president really in 50 years who has not used the military in some manner. Whether it's in Iraq and Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, of course the Vietnam conflict, we never declared war on Vietnam, the invasion of Grenada, the invasion of El Salvador, or military advisors in El Salvador. Suffice it to say, there hasn't been a president in 50 or 60 years who did not use the military for some reason. Again, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. Only Congress can declare war. Now, Congress can give the president what's called an authorization for the use of military force, AUMF. The Congress gave that to the president in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks to go into Afghanistan, later gave an AUMF to go into Iraq. Never declared war on Afghanistan, never declared war on Iraq. They just gave the president an authorization for use of military force. And the president used it. So, in that sense, Congress, again, we talked a lot about Congress over the years kind of abdicating their checks and balances in favor of a more powerful executive branch. This is one way. Congress, in doing this, is really taking themselves out of the equation when it comes to the use of military force. They're giving up part of their power, evidently voluntarily. Also, part of the president's duties is they are chief of state. That is, they are the U.S. representative. They are more than just a figurehead, although they most certainly are a figurehead. They are the ones that can legally, on the U.S.'s behalf, go and meet foreign leaders or welcome foreign leaders here. Presidents are the only ones that can sign legally binding treaties with other nations. Now, checks and balance, Senate has to approve all treaties. If you sign a treaty as a president with a nation and it's not ratified by the Senate, then if there are any legal requirements in that treaty, more importantly, if there's any money that needs to be spent, it doesn't have to be spent because Congress did not sign that in. Congress, or Senate in this case, did not approve. One of the issues with Barack Obama's presidency was he made a couple of overseas not just free trade deals, but just overall general deals, most notably with Iran, and he did not get Senate approval for it. One of the first things Donald Trump did was take the teeth out of that Iran treaty or negotiation, whatever you want to call it. It was never a treaty because Barack Obama had a nasty habit of doing things without going through Congress. If you don't go through Congress, the next president can undo it just as easily, and that's what Trump did largely in his first couple of months, was undo a lot of stuff that the prior president, Obama, had done, but had not gotten congressional approval. If Obama had gotten congressional approval, then Trump could not have just gone in and undone it. He would have had to go through Congress. Again, the main duty of a president, though, we mentioned commander-in-chief, chief of state, they are the chief executive. They head up the executive branch of government. That includes 15 cabinet departments and about 4 million employees. It is the largest bureaucracy in the world. And ultimately, the president is at the head of that. That includes the military. Without the military, it's like 2 2/3 million government employees. With the military, you're looking at 4.1 million people, all directly or indirectly answerable to the president. Again, it's a powerful position. The president has the power to appoint cabinets and secretaries of the standing federal agencies. There is no constitutional requirement per se for the agencies because we have created agencies off and on throughout the year. Homeland Security is the newest one. It was created in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. That's a new cabinet level department, and it is kept apart from military that's a very purposeful move on their part. Again, checks and balance. The Senate has to approve any cabinet secretary or any other of the president's cabinet appointments. Now, it used to be in the early days, before we had 4 million government employees, when the government was running on much less, that it was very common for a president to be elected and then just basically clean house. Everybody in the bureaucracy was replaced with someone loyal to the president. This was called the spoils system. To the victor go the spoils. Well, in this case, a president could give pretty decent paying jobs for 4 years to people whom he liked. And of course, the end result is everybody in the bureaucracy loved this president because they were essentially hired by them. The idea behind the spoils system was not ended, but really curtailed in 1883 with what was called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. It created basically a professional bureaucracy. It went on to say that there were certain government agencies or certain positions within the bureaucracy that the president could not appoint. So what happens is, over time, these people have become professionals in the EPA or the Department of the Interior or whatever, and they are not subject to presidential hiring and firing. The laws also, again, good and bad, they make sure that these non-political workers don't actively campaign for a politician. They're very limited in the political activity in which they can engage. The good news is it prevents the entire federal bureaucracy from being replaced every time a new president comes in. The bad news is, the unintended consequence. If you have an incompetent government worker, it is very hard to get rid of them. Very hard to justify that. Now, the president's personal, I hope you can hear the dog okay. President's personal staff in the White House includes about 4,000 people. President has a wide latitude over whom he can employ in the White House in particular. The bodies that come into existence in terms of the White House staff, mostly by Congress, but used to be, the White House was run with a minimal personnel. Now there is what's called the Executive Office of the President, which includes all kinds of people. Some of them are, very close to the president. Some are not. Some are sort of connected with a federal agency. Some are not. We're talking about, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Council of Economic Advisors, National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, called OMB. That's a very important one. They run a lot of the numbers. National Economic Council. Again, lots of advisors to the president. In something as complicated as the United States government with its 4 million workers, one guy is not going to be able to encompass the enormity of that. So the president has, hundreds and hundreds of official and unofficial advisors. One way the president can govern is through what's called executive orders. Executive orders are meant to be very specific orders from a president that basically dictate the way to carry out laws, the way to serve as an executive function, the chief executive of the United States. Executive orders have gotten a bad rap in recent years, and it's been well-deserved in many cases, but executive orders have been used to do great things. Harry Truman used an executive order to end racial segregation in the military. Under Republican presidents the last 40 years, they have issued executive orders to prevent any overseas entity that allows abortion from receiving federal money. They have no authority within the United States, but they can control that. They can also ban abortions in military hospitals. So every Republican president has done that until a Democratic president comes in and they issue executive orders to lift those executive orders. And round we go. Franklin Roosevelt had 3,700 executive orders. A lot of them created brand new government agencies. Barack Obama had, by comparison, only 234, but Obama was very, very upfront with his desire to govern largely with executive orders. Now, the advantage for a president there is you can have stuff done without getting congressional approval. As we mentioned earlier, congressional approval is needed to make these changes permanent if that's what you want to do. Plus, executive orders upset the checks and balances that have been built into our system of government. Again, it's like anything else. It can be used for good, but it really, really has to be looked at because there is great potential for constitutional mischief when we rely on executive orders. Every president has a different manner of dealing with Congress. Again, they have to act with Congress, in concert with Congress, to get new laws passed. Remember what we said last week. Only a congressman can introduce a law. A president cannot. So there have been varying degrees of cooperation from the president with Congress. Our last two presidents, Trump and Obama, have not worked well with Congress. They have been infamously at odds with Congress. George W. Bush had some success with Congress. Bill Clinton had a lot of success with Congress. So you get the idea that that also goes to governing styles. Some people are, presidents are very autocratic. My way or the highway, you don't do this. Others seek to build consensus. George H.W. Bush was big at that. Ronald Reagan's governing style was, here's what I want to have done, go do it. And people like Jimmy Carter was very much into the details. So, again, everybody has a different style of governance. That makes sense. We all do. And, of course, the other role that the president has, which sneaks into the judicial branch of government, is pretty controversial at times. Presidential pardons. Cannot issue a pardon to someone who was convicted in an impeachment trial. That makes sense. President gets impeached and, I pardoned myself. No, you can't do that. But it pretty much wipes the record clean on anyone who has been charged and convicted of a federal felony. Typically, president will issue his pardons a few days before he leaves office so he doesn't have to deal with the fallout. Some of these are very, very unpopular. Some very, very bad people, in my opinion, have been given presidential pardons, again, as a favor by the president. It's a pretty unsavory business, and I can only imagine if Trump loses the election, he will issue a flurry of pardons sometime in January of next year, and it's going to be interesting. The final little bit we're going to talk about this week is, again, we're going to go back to that relationship between the presidency and Congress. They are often at odds, but they have to work together to get a lot of stuff done. We talked about the checks and balances that are built into the system to make sure that one doesn't get more powerful than the other. There are some connections that are written into the Constitution. Again, the vice president is president of the Senate. The executive branch can approve the federal budget, but only Congress can draw it up. Again, the House controls the purse strings. The Congress can declare war at the president's request. Again, the veto legislation, Congress passes, it goes to the president. He can veto it, and 2/3 can override it. The Senate gets to approve treaties. They get to approve presidential nominations for the Supreme Court and otherwise. Again, a lot of what's built into the Constitution is the requirement that the presidency and the legislative branch have to work together. Now, in the early days of the Republic, Congress was the most powerful branch. Really, up until the Civil War, Congress was the most powerful entity of the U.S. government. Think about how many unremarkable presidents we had after Thomas Jefferson, 1800 to 1808. You probably remember only a handful of them before Lincoln because most of them, their job was merely to carry out what Congress did. All the great debates in the first half of the 19th century about the nature of America, the questions of slavery, those were largely dealt with by Congress. The Congress was where the rock stars were for the most part for 50 years. As we've gone on since then, though, again, civil war forces the president to take more of an active role. Anytime there's a war, the president, generally speaking, is going to step up and take a more active role. The thing is, once they take a more active role, they never step back. They stay here, and then the next president goes there, and then the next one goes there. Over time, Congress is much, much less important now than they were, say, for the first 50 years of this republic. Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson in the 20th century were presidents who saw their role as to do more than just do what Congress said. They were very, very reform-minded. The other constitutional requirement between the Congress and president is that the president is required to give a State of the Union address every year to Congress. We've turned that into a big, big deal. It's a cause celeb. All the networks and news networks go live with it and whatever. It's basically a political rally right now for the president's party and a chance for the members of the other party to see how much they can sit on their hands for an hour and a half. Presidents, of course, have to get stuff cleared through Congress, but the presidency is called the bully pulpit because, again, they have the authority to appeal directly to the American people. And again, oh, by the way, they occupy the most powerful office in all the world. So that's going to come with certain bits of power. The book mentions something I like to talk about. It's called gridlock. That's when you have one party controlling the presidency and a different party controlling one or both houses of Congress. Sometimes it happens when you have Democratic House, Republican Senate, or vice versa. Apologize for the light. Gridlock is when Congress reaches a state where they can get nothing done because of both sides digging in their heels politically. Usually the fallout, what happens is you get a government shutdown of non-essential workers. We've heard about that an awful lot in recent years. If we're talking foreign affairs or dealing with foreign nationals, generally speaking, Congress stands behind the president, but we are ditching a lot of those norms now because the current president is really unpopular with some members of Congress. They are actively opposing him, even when we have overseas issues. We do have one recent instance where Congress and the president tried to work together to, in this case, give the president a little more authority. For years, presidents had asked for what's called a line item veto. That is to say, they could go through the budget and look at all the millions and millions of items and say, okay, I don't want this, don't want this, don't want... Line item by line item, deciding what they didn't want to fund. Matter of fact, Congress passed a law to give the president in 1997 a line item veto, and Bill Clinton used it for 1 year. Until the Supreme Court decided, no, you can't do that. The Constitution gave the president a right to veto legislation, but not to redraw legislation. You either veto the whole dadgum thing or you accept the whole thing. You can't take out parts you like. The Supreme Court ruled that the president, in that instance, was basically being given the power to write law. I'll ask you what you think about that, because that is and it's a great recent example. It happened just 22 years ago, and it's a great example of the relationship between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The executive and the legislative trying to work together, trying to create something that they thought was needed, but the judicial stepping in and saying, you can't do that. Remember, one of the things I like is when I hear the government say, we can't do that. Anyway, we'll discuss that question on Monday. I'll have hopefully by then I'll have the weekly Week 6 quiz up for you. Until then, have a great day, and we will see you on Monday.